Okay, there's one other thing I would like you to talk about, is that when you talk about Valentino, you associate Valentino with your father. And I think there's a touchy relationship there. Maybe you could
Sure. Well, thank you for
bit.
asking. The piece on Valentino begins, I began reading about Rudolph Valentino while my father was dying, which is absolutely true. So here was the situation. And by the way, the entire book sprang from that image of a dying man. I was nursing my dad. He had brain cancer.
Yeah, very moving story there about
Thank you. Thank you.
Intimate.
Yeah. He was dying of brain cancer. And then to compensate for the deterioration of his body, I began reading about a so-called beautiful man, because Valentino was beautiful. He was hermaphrodite, right? He was a beautiful man and he was a beautiful woman. Okay. And so there was an integration and the appearance of the historical there. That was the first piece around which the whole book was built. Mm-hmm. And the elements in that story are, as you say, I think seminal as far as, I mean, there was, when I was writing it, the narrators were Valentino himself, because in the book there's a lot of research I did on all these figures. I read everything. Was Valentino, the father, and the son all together. Mm-hmm. And that's why it moved, you sense that it's moving from one to the other, from one to the other, because I wrote it that way. Because that's what made sense to me. Mm-hmm. See, you see, again, as I said last time, I think it's important for us to understand what we're proud of. Pride, just pride, for me was always an obstacle. It was like a weight. I try to understand Mona Lisa. Understand, because when I was growing up, right, who do you like, Frank Sinatra or Bing Crosby in the 40s? That was a big thing. So I get a chance, that's the angle, you know. I mean, I try to understand who these people are and what they meant or mean to me and my community. Mm-hmm. And that's the integration. I think that's very important. Fred Gardefee talks about demystification. I mean, breaking down these heroes in the sense of trying to understand who they are. And that's the attempt there.
Yeah, I see,
you know.
I see. There is another image, which I think from the literary, it goes into more of a symbolic, and maybe I'll elaborate what I mean by that. When you talk about Mario Cuomo and Lee Iacocca, you also, in that same piece, for the first time in the book, you show or you relate when you were born, or at least the main character was born, and the psychological aspect of life as it was born, even remember the mother's uterus. Yeah,
that was in the Johnny piece, in The Ordinary Man, when he's trying to understand where he was born. He's asking, he's telling Johnny, you know, like, he's what he's working on.
But in the part of Mario Cuomo and Lee Iacocca, you explained the first time that you were born and crying.
Is that right? You know, I tell you, if you could find it, I don't remember.
Yeah.
But I think what I remember is also in that piece he goes back to Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Because that was a time when Cuomo and Iacocca were talked about as presidential candidates.
Yeah.
This is the mid-'80s. And I think he goes back to the old neighborhood, and I think, well, what this narrator wants to be, he wants to be Cuomo's cultural minister, and he says, look, we understand why you really couldn't learn about your history, because you were the second, you had to improve on your parents. There was a lot of pressure on that generation.
I read from what I read, my interpretation was that by including the birth of this main character who becomes a writer, in a way complements and increments the idea of the good against the bad, not in a moral sense, the good people, I should say, the successful people. Here's Mario Cuomo, governor, who wants to become president, and Lee Iacocca was thought of being president. You associate then the birth of the writer.
Okay.
And these three together, these three personalities, the politician, the industrialist, and the writer, in a way, give birth to another type of Italian American, with the writer, the birth of the writer, and even the crying of the, because it's a difficult, you have to fight the society that you're in with the Godfather image of Puzo. And now the writer comes along, and from there, the writer becomes the new Italian-American image, or at least the hope of the writer is to create a new Italian-American image and a new Italian-American intellectual in a way.
That feels very comfortable when you're saying that. Again, I feel privileged. I mean, my grandfather was a sheet metal worker. He lived here, 60 years, never learned English. And I loved, being raised a lot by him, because he was in this house. It was very silent. It was very peaceful, and I used to sit beside him. So, and then there's, my father's or Cuomo's generation, the same generation, and they, as I said, felt a lot of pressure to improve. And then the next generation, I come along and say, okay, now I became a writer. I mean, I became. In other words, well, you see, I had the privilege and was able to break that.
But I connect this again back to the Mediterranean runs through Brooklyn in the story of the two Italians. There you said, you left it to the reader when the fellow says, "Oh, why to God, why?" You don't answer that question, but the reader, I as a reader, can answer. Is that the question is, the good person the good person does eliminate the bad person. Now in this story there is a step forward in saying, now this triad, these three figures will become the new Italian American.
Well, it's very interesting.
Maybe I'm reading too much.
No, you're exactly on target as far as at least the evolution of my work. Because look, you go from the Mediterranean to Anita Garibaldi. In Anita Garibaldi, there's no Anthony Valerio or according to Anthony Valerio. Okay? The preface was written by a distinguished professor of history, a colleague and friend of mine. And it is a straight story of her life based on, years of research. So, and that's political. And it's also of a woman. So there is a tie. My interest in presenting, because I'm empathetic and very empathetic and understand the women of that culture.
All right, we have about 3 minutes left. I would like to introduce another subject that you talk about also, about prejudice. Maybe you would like to elaborate, or maybe you want to read a page?
Well, I could, I think one of the responsibilities I felt in a cultural worker's responsibility is to make critical calls of his own community.
Right.
And I was certainly raised with racism. I mean, and I've moved through other cultures, and I've also been the object of racism. And certainly you had a figure like Joseph Hawkins murdered in Brooklyn by Italian Americans, and then there are changes there. But I wrote a piece in there in the conversation with Johnny called "The Gourmet Dish of Pasta," which goes like this. He's talking to Johnny, right? And he says to Johnny, they're sitting in the living room, "Do you remember our first introduction to racism? When our grandparents and then our parents used to stay in the kitchen all the time around the dinner table? They called Jews and blacks by the same name. And the Jews got all the jobs, and the Jews keep the Italians down. The Jews help one another while we don't. Why," our ancestors asked, "don't we help one another?" And the question never went answered. I remember, then later on, he's talking to Johnny, and he says, "I remember the poet warrior Ugo Foscolo, Garibaldi's favorite. Young Foscolo led his gang in an uprising to free the Jews penned up in his neighborhood of Zant, an isle off Venice. Jews were arrested if seen talking to a Christian. The lights in their neighborhoods were shut off so they couldn't stroll, convene, chat of an evening. I remember Dumas and Garibaldi, the novelist and the lion, the Frenchman and the red Italian. They were friends. Comrades in arms, fought together in Sicily." Johnny says, "No kidding." That's right. And so I thought that so I said, so then the Jew I read about has delighted children around the world for generations, grew up with Italians in Chicago, works in our cafes now. And do you know what he asked me once on Bleecker Street? This genius, this millionaire, he calls me and says, "Nicholas, where can I get a gourmet dish of pasta?" I looked around, the sun was shining. Bobby Fontana was across the street vending. "I'll get back to you," I said, and then went directly to Tutta Pasta on Carmine Street and to Raffetto's on Houston Street, where they make fresh every day, and inquired about the restaurants they supply. But in the end, I knew that my friend's gourmet dish of pasta lay in the palm of my hand. I called him. "Come over," I said. "I'm making pasta tonight."
Very good.